On 11 April, the African Union chairperson and Senegalese president, Macky Sall, noted that he had received a call from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The leaders discussed the global economic impact of the Ukrainian crisis and the salience of dialogue in the quest to end the conflict. President Zelensky also asked to address the African Union. This request can be located within the context of President Zelensky's global charm offensive. The Ukrainian leader has become famous for his speeches to national, especially European parliaments and international organizations across the globe, including the United States Congress and German, British, French, Italian, Japanese, and Israeli parliaments, as well as the United Nations and the European Union. He uses his rhetorical prowess to request international support, invoking memories of historical events and tragedies such as the Berlin Wall, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, Fukushima, and the Holocaust. Africa has been divided on the Ukrainian crisis, with many countries either remaining neutral or opposing condemnation of Russia's aggression against the backdrop of Moscow's relationship with the continent since the Cold War. It is in the light of this that the Future of Diplomacy Research Group at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for the Future of Knowledge has put together a panel of distinguished speakers to address this fundamental topic. I would just like to welcome our distinguished panelists and honorable guests to this important webinar. My name is Oluwaseun Tella, the head of the Future of Diplomacy Research Group at the Institute. The Institute for the Future of Knowledge was established at the University of Johannesburg as one of the centers of excellence to conduct research. The Institute is a transdisciplinary ecosystem devoted to understanding the relationship between knowledge and the future for the purpose of improving both. The Future of Diplomacy Research Group seeks to promote the understanding of diplomacy, negotiation, and statecraft in contemporary international politics. The group also aims to support research in modern diplomatic practice by redefining diplomacy in contemporary and futuristic context in an increasingly complex and globalized world. Given the fact that the Russian-Ukraine crisis is one of the fundamental phenomena the world has witnessed in the 21st century, the Future of Diplomacy Research Group at the Institute has been setting the pace in the discussion of this conflict at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and I dare say in Africa. To this end, we have organized a webinar series that addresses the subject matter. The first of the series, titled The Russia-Ukraine Crisis, Escalation or Détente, was held in March. The key speakers were Ambassador Ilya Rugachev, Russian ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, former American ambassador to Ukraine, and distinguished Professor David Maples, based at the University of Alberta in Canada. The webinar was chaired by our own Professor Susie Graham. Today's event is the second of the series, and the final one will be held soon. Please watch out for this important event. At this juncture, I find it absolutely imperative to invite the chair of today's meeting, Professor Arthur Muntabara, who is the director of the Institute and former Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks. And I want to thank you all for participating in this seminar. Now, what we're trying to do is to address this matter of Africa's divergent views on the Ukraine crisis, and then say, how do we envisage the future? What does it all mean? And to do so, we have a very capable panelists, a set of panelists, the Ukrainian ambassador in South Africa, the Nigerian ambassador of South Africa, and Professor David Monyai. I'll say a bit more about these panelists as we bring them to the floor to speak to us. But as we do this, let me try to frame this discussion. It's already been indicated there's been an approach by President Zelensky to address the AU. The question is, should President Zelensky address the AU? And what is the motivation? What do we expect to find from that address? And what should Africans do in preparation for that address? Now, when we say Africans are divided, what do we mean? There were two major votes at the AU. The first one on the 2nd of March, 2022, to condemn Russia and ask it to move out of Ukraine. It was overwhelmingly adopted by 141 out of 193 members, with 12 abstentions, and with 12 people being outside the room. We'll talk about what that means. And then the second vote on the 7th of April, 2022, this one was to remove Russia from the Human Council, the UN Human Council, Human Rights Council. This was voted in by 93 out of 193 members, with 18 people being out of the room. Now, these were the global votes. Where were the Africans? On the first vote, only one African voted against that motion, and 28 voted for the motion to condemn Russia, and 17 abstained, and 8 were not in the room. Now, those not in the room presumably do not want to identify with either for, against, or the abstention. So they would rather be out of the room. In the second vote, which was to vote out and remove Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, 9 African countries were for, 9 were against, 24 abstained. And in this case, 12 chose to be out of the room. Why are these disparities? What are the reasons behind these differences in terms of the African vote? What is going on in terms of the African vote? In terms of the countries themselves, 4, we have Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt in the first vote. Against, we have Eritrea. Abstaining, we have South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Sudan. And then those that chose not to be in the room, we have Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Eswatini, Togo, Morocco, and Guinea-Bissau. What is going on the continent? Why these differences in terms of the views of the Africans? We hope that our panelists will be able to address these matters today. On the second vote, there's a shift now. Nigeria abstains, South Africa abstains, Egypt abstains, Angola, Botswana, and Kenya. All those countries abstained in the vote to remove Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Those against that vote were Algeria, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Gabon. What is the rationale behind these votes at the UN? Those voting for, we have Liberia, DRC, Sierra Leone, Malawi, and those that chose not to be in the room. And we want to understand this, Ambassador from Nigeria and Professor Monyai. What does it mean when an African country chooses not to be in the room? Zambia, Rwanda, Morocco, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Benin, Guinea, all those countries, they chose to be outside the room. They didn't want to identify with for, against, or abstaining. What does this all mean? We hope that we'll be able to address these matters. This is how the map looks. So what we are saying as we begin this seminar, Ambassador from Ukraine, why should President Zelensky address the AU? What can we get from that address? Why are the Africans divided on the war in Ukraine? What are the reasons for the various African positions? What are the implications of all this to the African agenda? In fact, should Africans care at all about the war in Ukraine? What is the future of African diplomacy? These are some of the questions and issues we hope our distinguished panelists will be able to address and tell us the way forward. Who are we? As explained already, we are in the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. We seek to create new knowledge and novel thought leadership. With this webinar, we seek to have a sense of where the future of African diplomacy is headed. What is the future of African diplomacy given the diversity of opinion among the Africans at the AU? We are keen to understand the reason behind the divergence, and also we hope that the panelists will be able to help the IFK in its journey to the future of diplomacy. As I indicated earlier on, we have a distinguished panel. We start with Ambassador Lyubimov Avritova. She is the ambassador of Ukraine in South Africa and also Mozambique and Botswana. She's an expert in international relations and also has a master's in security studies. So she'll be our first panelist. Ambassador, we're very keen to understand the motivation of President Zelensky in terms of addressing the AU. What is the motivation? What do you hope to achieve? And also maybe you can give us an insight into your own thinking as ambassador as to why the Africans are so divided on the war in Ukraine. So with those few words, I want to call upon the ambassador to come in and share with us. You have 15 minutes, ambassador.
Good day, dear colleagues. Thank you, Professor. First of all, let me express my gratitude to the University of Johannesburg for organizing this panel discussion. And, you know, I intendedly did not intervene into the process of formulating the topic, though I would like to point out that today, on the 77th day of Russia's brutal, barbaric war of choice in Ukraine, number of proven atrocities and casualties on the ground should not allow us to call this invasion Ukrainian crisis anymore. Meantime, it is positive that this conversation will launch the dialogue on what will be the ramifications of this Russian war for African continent. And I'm very grateful for your attention to Ukrainian side aspiration to have a floor at the African Union and to acknowledge importance of the continent and each particular country of continent in the peaceful solution of this war. Let me start by saying that initially we've seen a very varied response to the Russian invasion across the continent. And the African Union expressed its extreme concern at the situation in Ukraine when Russia launched its military operation on 24th of February, and the African Union called for the immediate ceasefire and negotiations without delay. In the west of Africa, in ECOWAS, we've seen the statement that said that the countries were condemning the Russian invasion and called on both parties to stop fighting and for all parties to ensure the safety of all citizens that live in Ukraine. We remember that the war of Russia is happening only on the territory of Ukraine, of the sovereign state. Then we've seen in the Horn of Africa, the group of countries IGAD also expressed its concern about the situation in Ukraine, and they called on parties to show the restraint and to give the safe passage, I guess, to, as I remember, to those people who were already blocked in some areas that was under control of Russia at that time. So in the United Nations Security Council, in that vote when Russia vetoed the draft resolution of UN Security Council that would have called on Russia to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine and withdraw its military forces, there were 3 African countries, non-permanent representatives of the Security Council, namely Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya, that all voted for the draft resolution. And we remember the prominent speech of the Kenyan side at the emergency meeting when he spoke, the permanent representative of Kenya spoke about the importance of respect of territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And he was relating this to Africa's colonial past and the need to reject expansionism by force. Then, as already Professor mentioned, there were several votes in the United Nations General Assembly where we've seen the overwhelming support of the world community, with some difference among the 24 countries of the African continent. And yes, 28 of them voted in favor of the first resolution, only 1 being voting against. We know which country was that. And later when, and what was not mentioned maybe is the second resolution that was voted for humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Also, we've seen some interesting shift when more countries supported that particular resolution. And I believe Senegal and South Sudan, who abstained in the previous 2 March resolution, voted this time in its favor. So it's really interesting dynamics, and we've seen very different narratives or justifications on different periods of these 77 days why it was happening. We've seen that countries consciously or compulsorily but classified Russian aggression as a European war caused by defects of the European security system. And according to some of the war was a local conflict. So to say something like bloody war in Yemen, which has limited global impact despite horrific crimes against humanity and many casualties. It is important to remember the critical differences between Russian war in Ukraine and other conflicts. First, it takes place in Europe, where the 2 previous world wars, the bloodiest in human history, originated. Secondly, this is the first opened armed attack by a nuclear state on a country that has voluntarily abandoned its nuclear weapons, the first largest arsenal at that time in the world. And thirdly, it is the most brutal violation in recent history of multilateral security guarantees provided by a group of leading countries to another country in exchange for nuclear disarmament. It is not surprising that we have such a diverse reaction toward the Russian aggression in Ukraine. On African continent, we will see quite a lot of pro-Russian forces that are active in some countries, particularly in Uganda or Central African Republic or in Cameroon and some other countries of the continent. In fact, it is very obvious many African countries have suffered from imperialistic rule of the West for centuries. For them, Russia is still associated with the Soviet Union, which has an antagonist of the West. And this is the very ideology, is the very crucial element by which or through which we can understand why certain countries are choosing to be neutral. But by doing this, on my humble opinion, they are supporting this idea of imperialistic Russia. Russia is still living in the past. It's still living by and through the stereotypes of the USSR. And I will not be tired to say that USSR was not Russia. It was 15 countries at that time, and Ukraine was one of them. So when you speak about, and you think about your sentiments towards USSR, you also have to include Ukraine into them. So understanding of intricacies of Lenin's formation of Ukraine, as Putin is trying to present it, is hampered by the fact that a lot of African countries just overburdened with their own problems, which are so significant that they have become much more acute in recent years due to COVID, pandemics, and chronic economic instability. Africa was not united in its reply to Russian aggression and violation of the values. Africa itself is fighting, or was fighting, I'm sorry, for decades. But what happened is that African countries underestimate the ramifications, the consequences of the war for themselves. The war has and will disrupt global production, supply chains, and increase logistic costs. This will increase global inflation and therefore depress global growth. Russia plus Ukraine combined produced 28% of world's global wheat and 18% of corn. Since Russian invasion on the 24th of February, the prices for wheat already jumped around 27%. Ukraine, on its own, produces 80% of the world's neon gas. This one is the component of microchips used for computer screens, for smartphone screens. So just think about the consequences of interruption of these supply chains. Ukraine is also the world's largest exporter of sunflower oil on its own. It produced 45% of the global sunflower seed and oil, with Russia producing around 23% of global output. So you see that it's not only about the agricultural commodities, but also when you look at the fertilizer supplies that both countries provided to the Middle East and North Africa region, to the Sub-Saharan region, you will see that when the war of Russia in Ukraine destroyed the country's food production, the direct effect of this will immediately and is immediately felt on African continent. The sanctions, this is something also that we have to speak, how they affect. We can speak in general now, I don't have much time, I see. So the sanctions obviously affected and blocked a lot of products that traditionally were supplied from Russia to the African continent. We see the increase of oil prices. We see the financial sector is becoming quite effective. Let me maybe say several words on what is going to happen next. Recently, the UN Security General Antonio Guterres visited Russia and then visited Ukraine. And he warned after this visit that Russian invasion is leading to a growing hunger crisis, particularly in African continent. And there is no solution to the problem, and let me quote here, without bringing back the agriculture production of Ukraine and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war. End of the quote. The United Nations also called for Black Sea ports to be reopened to allow grains from Ukraine to reach Ethiopia and South Sudan, as well as Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, that are really crucially dependent on these supplies. Currently, all the ports of Ukraine are under Russian blockade. And according to the United Nations World Food Programme, the indirect effect from Russia's invasion on Ukraine is worsening an ongoing food and security crisis in parts of East Africa, and particularly in Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan. We remember that the Horn of Africa region is experiencing its worst drought in recent 40 years. Most of African leaders are struggling to control rising inflation. And in all these circumstances, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is something that we would need to address urgently. Concluding, I want to say that Africa itself and its interest is to work today with global partners, to diversify global partners. When you are asking me why it is important for our president to speak to the African Union, I would connect it to the last point that you did, what will be the future of African diplomacy. And I think that today we have to speak not only about diversification of economies, but also about the diversification of foreign policy. And I believe that the outcome, one of the outcomes of the war after our victory, the victory of Ukraine, will be that the partnering with other countries will not be based anymore on the past, on the ideologies, or on personal connections of the leaders of continent, but it will be more dependent on the variety of partners in order to provide development for the countries of African continent, the democratic and peace interest of its population. Let me stop on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that detailed presentation. I hope you'll be able to take some questions and comments from the audience. We'll try to make sure we have enough time for all the people from across the globe to have a say on this discussion. I'll move on quickly to Ambassador Mohammed Manta from Nigeria. He's a career diplomat, 41 years in diplomacy. He's got a degree in geography and also is an expert in international relations. He's currently the ambassador of Nigeria, or the High Commissioner, to South Africa, Lesotho, and Eswatini. Ambassador Manta, can you tell us what is informing these African views on the war in Ukraine? Why the diversity of opinion? And why is there movement? When you look at some of the countries now, Nigeria, for example, your own country, at the beginning, you voted for the condemnation of Russia. But in the third vote, which was the vote on the 7th of April, you abstained. Also, the ambassador from Ukraine referred to Kenya, Gabon, and Senegal. Gabon and Senegal voted for the condemnation of Russia, but in the third vote on the 7th of April, they voted, Kenya voted against, Kenya voted to abstain, and Gabon voted against. What's going on with the African opinion? What is informing the African decisions with respect to the war in Ukraine? Ambassador Manta, the moment is yours. You've got 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Your Excellencies, distinguished professors from the academia and captains of diplomacy and international politics. Good evening. I'm pleased to be sharing ideas with you on this forum this evening. I hope I was having challenges with my instruments prior to the commencement of this discussion. I hope I'm clear now that you can hear me. If you can, then let me start by thanking Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine, for having enlightened us principally on some of the issues. So I wouldn't waste much time on same issues as elucidated by her. So I will go straight to the major areas of the discussion, which is principally the reaction of the African countries, rather the African continent, to the crisis in between Russia and Ukraine. Prior to the escalation of hostilities, there were some backroom politics and decisions taken. And Russia made it very clear that if these certain conditions were met, the crisis could be solved and escalation of hostilities would be halted. But somehow the international community either ignored that or did not heed some of the warning signals that we are coming. Let me take us back a little through history. Sometime in 1962, there was some crisis, which we call the Cuban Missile Crisis, between the United States and the then USSR. And in spite of the closeness of Cuba to the USSR, those missiles could not be deployed, and crisis was avoided and averted. So this time around, you see, America brought up an internal decision by their parliament that a friend to their enemy, their neighbor being a friend to their enemy becomes their enemy. So with that statement, it was clear that they said they will invade and destroy Cuba if Cuba allows Russia to deploy missiles by their doorsteps, 90 nautical miles from Florida. So winding back or fast forwarding that type of scenario, it is similar to the position Russia took on Ukraine. Don't join NATO. If you join NATO, we would stop that as much as we can because the threat will now come to our doorsteps. So if the international community had taken that threat seriously, probably a single word that, oh, okay, we will not join NATO, or we will only remain observers in NATO, or something similar could have avoided the crisis. But that now is history. So coming back to from 24th February, when hostilities commenced, the African continent, I must say, has not had the privilege of having the presidents meet en bloc. The next bloc meeting of the presidents and heads of state of African countries is coming up later this month. That if that opportunity had come, it would have been very easy, it was rather easier to gauge the mood of the continent at a glance. But having not had that opportunity, the next was our representatives at the United Nations. So when the issue came up at the United Nations, each country had to vote according to their conscience and according to their beliefs and partnerships around the world. So let me be very, very succinct on Nigeria, for instance. We had divergent views, and the first vote we voted for, principally in tandem with our constitutional provision back home that recognizes and respects the sovereignty of nations all over the world. So if I may say that we have respect for territorial integrity and political independence of nation states around the world, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, as well as settlement, our belief in the settlement of international disputes through reconciliation, mediation, and adjudication. So for another country one state to invade another, Nigeria will stand to condemn that anytime, any part of the world. And so we voted in accordance with our constitution to condemn Russia for attacking Ukraine. In the second vote, we abstained principally because in addition to whatever position we took in the first vote, the room for arbitration as well as adjudication had not been exhaustively pursued. So based on that, it was our belief that the vote to expel Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Commission was premature, and therefore we abstained. Those were what then happens with other African countries or future relations to Africa? It is my humble opinion that the African Union remains the rallying point for all the African countries to speak with one voice. And then African countries also have the singular, thread to also unite and join other regions in demanding the restructuring of the UN. If we demand the restructuring of the United Nations, some of the issues that prevent even the world from acting in unison on some of these issues could be avoided. So African countries must therefore rise and work towards revamping and strengthening non-aligned movements, and then also give other countries south of the Sahara particularly a voice in world affairs. So by and large, the Ukrainian issue now, paramount in world international politics, is that the Americans, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. So if America felt that missiles cannot be deployed at their doorsteps, they should also avoid deploying missiles to other doorsteps that are equally powerful in their own perception, and they have the might to bite, not just to back. So Russia is saying that in spite of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that they still have the strength to bite, to back and bite. So if it was the view of the European Union as well as the United States to think that Russia will not bite, they will only back, then probably that situation has been proven wrong and counterproductive. What I would now say, as my humble opinion, is the UN coming more forcefully to debate the issues and call for the escalation of hostilities. We should go towards ending the hostilities in unison, and that should be the focus of the international community. Let me also say that since towards the end of this month, the African heads of state and government are meeting in Addis. Probably would also the Zelensky addressing them will change very little the present positions as it were. But they say he who wants to go to equity should go with clean hands. If Zelensky addresses the AU, it will be a welcome development. But the relationship between Soviet Union, or rather Russia, and the Ukraine is endemic. It predates even the AU itself, as it were. It was in the days of the OAU, when during our fight against apartheid and colonialism in Southern Africa, that the relationship was more solidified. And I do not see it now crumbling because of this crisis. It will remain so, backed by strong economic diplomacy, where we import most of our Greek products, including wheat, fertilizers. So, and then the military hardware all come from those two countries. So it is the interest of Africa as well to see the escalation of hostilities, so that the economy of African countries that has been jilted by the fight going on now can be restored. The issue of also the economy of Europe that is shaken with sanctions can also pick up before the severity of winter sets in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those remarks. We're going to move on to Professor David Monyai. You are not an ambassador, so you don't have to defend any country. So we expect you to be candid and address all the issues that we want addressed in this seminar. In particular, the Constitutive Act of the AU talks about having a common foreign policy. So these African countries are actually violating their own Constitutive Act, which says we are going to try as much as possible to have the same common position vis-a-vis countries and affairs external to Africa. Why are African countries doing this? Why are the African countries divided? What are some of the reasons why countries are abstaining, voting for, voting against, or choosing to be out of the room? Professor Monyai is the director at the UJ Center for Africa-China Studies. He's an expert in international relations and foreign affairs, and is an associate professor of political science and international relations. Professor, tell us what is going on the continent of Africa. Why are these Africans behaving in this manner?
Thank you, Professor Atham Tambara. Firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you and your organization for organizing this seminar, as well as to pay tribute to the ambassadors on the panel. My starting point is very simple. Answer the set questions that you have set, and try to also pick some of the issues already mentioned. We really need to put the entire crisis happening, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, into perspective. That's the very first thing. The historical perspective is quite important. A history that should also include the African continent. So, Ambassador from Ukraine, for Africa, if we look at the history, is that our ancestors fought in the First and Second World War. Africans shed their blood in the First and Second World War. And some of us can claim ancestors that really battled in those wars. And in that context is that Africans, even though they were under colonial rule, they were fighting for one issue, which is freedom, liberty, democracy, which they were denied at home by colonial powers. And those who returned home, they were not rewarded. A majority of them were given bicycles, while their white compatriots were given houses and the like. So the history is quite rich in terms of Africa's participation at a global level and the role that Africans played in the global history, whether you look at it the First or Second World War. And these wars were in Europe indeed. And I think it is also important that for the African continent prospers and the continent also suffers if there are global instability. And as it stands, overwhelming Africans are anti the war, are anti-destabilization of any nature. It is in Africans' interest to have peace and stability at a global level. I think we need to clear that right up front. And therefore, Africans are for liberty, Africans are for democracy, Africans are for freedom and sovereignty of nations. And it is important to also mention that at the moment, at this particular juncture, the African continent has no space within the global political and economic governance structures, namely the United Nations Security Council. We have no representation in that structure. It remains a structure that we need so much given the conflicts that are ongoing on the African continent, as well as the role that the United Nations is playing, whether in health and all other structures. And therefore, the United Nations, the international community in its totality, it's critical for the African continent. And there is no view that Africa is taking sides. We are aware of comrades in the then Soviet Union, which includes Ukraine. At no point has Africa pointed or separate Ukrainian comrades or Russian comrades. And therefore, the entire 15 former Soviet Union states are seen as one. Where is the problem, therefore? Why are we saying our problem lies at the heart of the global system as we speak, where Africa falls within? It's a system that is defined by hegemony, hegemonic behavior of powerful states that subject poor, weaker into instability, supporting dumping weapons denying vaccines in the era of COVID, and a number of factors that Africa finds itself in the margins of a system that is not fair, it's undemocratic, to a large extent illegitimate in its look. And the view that Ukraine, as much as we are pro-peace, human rights, and with the people of Ukraine at their darkest hour, ordinary Ukrainians, we are quite aware that the end of the Soviet Union brought in the crisis we are in. It is those unresolved issues are critical that we cannot ignore, wherein Russian Federation concerns, genuine concerns in certain areas were not adhered to. And we all worried at the heart of this statement is the role of NATO, which has nothing to do with Ukraine. Ukraine became a victim. NATO bombed Libya, and we see the role of NATO going extra-regional in terms outside its mission, its original mission in terms of Europe. It's getting into quite a number of areas, including at our own African continent. So I'd like to put it on the record that it is not Ukraine alone that willingly and rightly gave up its weapons. South Africa, our own country, gave up its weapons, nuclear weapons, and Libya gave up its weapons. And what happened to Libya? Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated. The country was destroyed by NATO. And that brings me in Africa, in answering some of these questions, that firstly, it's not the first time that Africa finds itself in a disunity, lack of understanding of global issues, regardless of the role that the continent has played. Historically, that what I've mentioned in the First World, Second World War, in the formation of then OAU up to Lagos Plan of Action 1979, the African continent has been calling for reforms of the United Nations to allow African states to have a seat and a say and legitimize this structure. And no one seemed to understand or take Africa serious. Up to today, we see the very same issue. And therefore, as much as we understand the disruptive nature of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, as far as the global value chains that the ambassador has mentioned, we are saying those are not only core issues. I think we need to avoid mentioning terms that I used: hegemony, NATO, destructive role, as well as ensure that we in Africa continue to be participants at a global level in a fair and in a respectable way, other than looking in a very patronizing that you're going to die of hunger, you need food. I think Africa needs more than that. It's not just a question of Ukrainian wheat, which is at the heart of Africa's concern. It's much deeper than that. It's the systemic entire system that we need to look into that needs reform. We also are looking at how the African continent itself has internal built-in weaknesses that explains the disunity, the votes that don't make sense. Our Nigerian ambassador had made it very clear, and that speaks directly to the heart of issues, the head of states haven't met. And therefore, if they had met prior, the conflict on the 24th of February wouldn't be where we are. With due respect, Ambassador, systems, institutions should not operate that head of states should meet. It has to operate. It has to do with the fact that the AU is much more heavy loaded, led by head of states. The bureaucracy, the policy, it's not strong. It lacks continuity and change, and it is more on the names of head of states. So therefore, when certain head of states leave the stage, we see these problems. With the Libyan crisis in 2011, South Africa and Nigeria abandoned the continent. They voted in favor of Resolution 1973, which in itself was one of the greatest mistakes led by the most powerful countries on the African continent. And this time around, we were shocked with the Nigeria's first vote, and happy to see the change and understanding of the situation on the ground. It is in Africa's interest to abstain, that's one, and call for peaceful resolution to the crisis in favor of the Ukrainian people, and to call for the continent to speak with one voice on matters of global peace and security. And we see this lacking within the structure itself. Therefore, this poses a question. Should President Zelensky address the African Union? The simple answer is yes. The African continent should not take sides. It should allow President Zelensky, as well as President Putin, to address the AU and give their different perspective to allow the continent to understand before making any collective decision on issues. What's going to happen? What will be the future of African diplomacy? We will see a gradual unity with time. It is unfortunate that Nigeria and South Africa are not as united today as they used to be. And I say this with a heavy heart, that whenever Nigeria and South Africa speak with one voice, President Obasanjo and President Beki speaking, President Wade, President Bouteflika, the African agenda was strong. The continent spoke with one voice. The continent faced the international community in a unified voice in constructing the NEPAD process, which was a continuity of the Lagos Plan of Action, which today we call the Agenda 2063 vision. And for the lack of unity, and we see conflicts on our continent, including in Ethiopia, the political headquarters of the continent itself, it's disheartening. And however, I think the future remains bright. We're seeing quite a number of developments on the African continent, that this conflict, it's a crisis, it's also an opportunity of turning things around in terms of Africans realizing that they have 60% of global arable, most fertile land in the world. The African continent should not be buying food from outside the continent. I think this gives the African continent a realization, as it came to our understanding during and still the COVID-19 crisis, that you had vaccine nationalism. The continent has to, as much as build its pharmaceutical, it has to look into peace and stability, activate that land ensure that there is sufficient food on the African continent and be able to sell at the global market. I think the continent should and must continue pushing for peace in the Russia-Ukraine, using all good offices, including the Pope, ensure that issues of Ukrainians as well as issues of Russians come to a consensus. The bigger question that one will ask, why do we continue losing lives unnecessary if we know in the end victory won't come at the battlefield? Victory is going to come, Ambassador, through a negotiated way out. Why do we waste time in the battlefields instead on a round table? And we call upon the Russians, the Ukrainians to find a consensus and ensure that issues between Ukraine and Russia on one part are addressed, but broadly, Russian issues with the expansion of NATO is understood clearly, and unresolved issue from the breakaway, the Soviet Union breakaway, are somehow handled. Issues of ethnic, human rights violation, not only what we hear on CNN, but go beyond. And we must say, Russia today has been banned in our own country. We can't see Russia today. And these are some of the lessons that we need to learn and ensure that we, in future, understand the power dynamics and ensure that the African head of states appeal to President Zelensky to reach out to President Putin. I think he's doing, with fairness, he has been doing that. The two head of states must meet. I do not think pumping weapons, sophistry drones, kamikaze drones that are going, and which is becoming as a movie. This is real lives, real blood, which is being, whether it's Russian troops, whether it's Ukrainian troops, or civilians that are dying. And we've seen that in Syria, we have seen that in Iraq, we've seen it in Libya, where innocent people are killed and no one really gives any attention. So I would like to close by appealing to the ambassador, advising President Zelensky and the support that Africans have for a peaceful resolution in the Russian and Ukrainian crisis. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor David Munyai, for those detailed remarks. I'll give the panelists a chance to come back and say a few words and answer questions raised by their colleagues and also from the floor. But at this moment, I'm going to go to the floor. And when I give you an opportunity, you have 3 minutes maximum to say what you got to say, either a remark or a question. You got 3 minutes. I start with TK Pue. TK Pue, can you go ahead and speak for 3 minutes?
No, thank you very much, Chair. Mine is a short one because I did put it in the chat already. It was to say, is the issue maybe of the African position, whether it is united or not united, I think it's immaterial, but I'm looking at the actions of, well, the patronizing actions of the EU and the US, and possibly even the Ukrainian ambassador's actions within South Africa, which come across as being very patronizing. And when you see that, it does make you raise serious questions about why is it that it's so important that we take a position as opposed to being more critical? Is there a problem when African states take a critical position? Not to say we are for nor against, but to take a critical position. And what we've seen from this is that when African states, such as South Africa, say, listen, let's really think about this, it would seem as though there's a patronizing action which comes from the EU and the US, and including the ambassador, which almost seems to beat down this position. And I'm reminded of the External Minister of India, Mr. S. Jenkinshah, who's actually said the same thing, that allow us to make our own decision about this. We're not for or against, but allow us to make critical interventions. But it would seem as though there's a patronizing action which comes from the EU and the US, and also the ambassador in how they act, how she's acted in a country like South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Muleya, you got 3 minutes, Muleya.
Hi, it's actually Miss. I hope you can hear me.
Miss. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
it's all right. Yeah, thank you very much. So sorry I came late, but I listened to the interventions by the three speakers, Tel and the ambassador. I wanted to say that, first of all, really sorry about what's happening in Ukraine. I just returned from Ukraine 2 days ago, and it was absolutely mayhem. I met with a lot of your people there, the ministers, the government. We met with the presidency. The issue here is, for me, is that, one, we have to, as Africans, remember where we're coming from. What I saw was an issue of ethnic superiority. So we have to accept that Russia sees Ukraine in a particular way, and therefore went in and did what it did. But we have to remember that we have suffered under such things in the past ourselves before. And so we need to really think about that. At the same time, I also acknowledge the fact that Africans should not just be asked to come in and support causes when it's time to support causes. We should also be put on the agenda. And that's part of the things that we were saying to them. I went in an Amnesty International delegation, and the part of the things we were saying to them was that they need to actually engage Africans on an equal level, and not where we say, well, you won't have any food, because that does sound patronizing. So we have to start thinking differently around how we engage. And when President Zelensky speaks to the AU, I think that he really needs to think deeply about how to foster deeper and more useful relationships with African governments and African people. But just to return to the one very quick point is that the Soviet Union, we should not overstate its role in Africa. We know what the role has been, and the Soviet Union, as somebody said already, included countries like Ukraine. So I'm from Zambia, and the military in Zambia was trained by Ukraine. And I just discovered actually that even some South African militia were trained by Ukraine under the banner of the Soviet Union. So we should also remember that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. We'll move on to Prosper. Prosper has got 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Prosper from Ghana. The few graphics that I have on this war is what I've seen in documentaries, 60 minutes, President Zelensky being interviewed by 60 minutes. And then the document goes ahead to show the chaos and the mayhem in Ukraine. You can't justify this in any way. Africa does not need a united front to be able to say that this war is crime against humanity. We should be bold. I am happy that my country, Ghana, voted against this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That's all I want to say, because it's a breach of international law and we should not condone it in any way. Thank you very much.
Since from the floor, I'm going to go back to the panelists so that they can respond to what they want to respond to, respond to each other, and respond to the questions from the floor. I start with the ambassador from Ukraine. You got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I would like again to stress what I started from, that it is important to understand that the previous 2 wars started in Europe. And when I'm saying this, I'm not excluding or underestimating the role of African countries. And yearly, from year to year, here in South Africa, we're paying tribute to those Africans who lost their lives in the world wars. The first remark. The second one is that the conflict that you say could be avoided on the 24th of February this year was not avoided because all the world was silent when the annexation of Crimea happened. The war in Ukraine didn't start on 24th of February. It started in 2014 with invasion in Donbass as well, when Russians killed 14,000 Ukrainians before the 24th of February. Yes, we have a lot of mutual and common in our histories, and we abandoned our nuclear weapons together with South Africa. And that's why, particularly South Africa has to feel what can happen when you have your guarantees by international community, which are not respected after the years. I believe that the critical position that is mentioned here during one of the comments regarding the attitude of the ambassador of Ukraine in South Africa. Please remember, I am the ambassador of Ukraine in 3 other countries, and I always respect the position of the hosting country and never was going against it. Though in this country of freedom of speech, I'm using this tool and instrument as any one of you, and this is my democratic freedom. We are today in Ukraine are fighting for democracy, liberty, and sovereignty, for those principles that are so close to all African countries. And we're fighting for them not only for Ukrainians, we are fighting them for the world. This is the war of values. And I want us to understand it very, very carefully. The attempts to put or represent the invasion of Ukraine launched by Russia as a Ukrainian fault doesn't have any logic, because this narrative suggests that a combination of Kyiv's aspiration for NATO membership, its ambition for closer integration with richer European countries, and its preference for a full, open, democratic system of government has meant it deserves Russian intervention. According to this logic, Russia did not attack Ukraine, but Ukraine mounted an illegitimate defense to itself, of itself. I want to remind those who are still trying to look at Russian invasion in Ukraine through the lens of Ukrainians' aspiration to NATO and to become the member of NATO and EU, that the NATO membership was not on the table and would not be possible in the nearest decade, at least, for Ukraine. That is why it cannot be justification of Russian actions in Ukraine. And I'm sure that most of you also seen the previous meeting organized by the esteemed university, where it was absolutely clear, explained the role of NATO, the aspiration and the reasons of not only Ukrainian desire to become a part of this alliance, but of many other countries. And what will be interesting to see, and why it's important to speak on this platform with you as representatives of African countries, is what kind of shift in geopolitics, in the providing of security guarantees in the future world we will see. And obviously this shift is going to happen. Thank you.
Moving on to Ambassador Mohamed Matta. Ambassador, tell us, why are African leaders not talking? Why is Nigeria not talking to South Africa? Why is the AU not talking before taking foreign policy positions? What is wrong with us in terms of our foreign policy formulation vis-a-vis global affairs? And also other matters raised from the floor and from your colleagues. Ambassador Mohamed Matta, the moment is yours. You've got 5 minutes.
Thanks, Prof. You see, the Ukrainian crisis should not be viewed in isolation. And I wish to thank Professor David Moye for giving us a panoramic view of some of the crises where collective decisions were expected, and even when they were taken, they were never respected. We had the Syrian crisis. We had on our own continent, we had the Libyan crisis. Even when the whole of the AU had passed a resolution to be given time to intervene before the mediation team could arrive at Tripoli, NATO planes started bombing and they remained, like they say, it's now history. So interventions principally only attract rhetorics from the world organizations, including the AU as well as the United Nations. The feeling by some was that probably one or two countries will go to assist the Ukrainians to fight, but it is not the case. It has never happened, and it's not going to happen this time around that either Britain or United States will go to physically assist Ukraine. What they are offering is paltry sums of money, and money doesn't fight wars. So like Professor David said, the solution will still have to be on the table. Now, the African countries, we issued a statement condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and that was done by the AU Secretariat. Like we always say, the Secretariat, if you check the records, the AU chair and the Secretary issued a statement condemning the action of Russia in invading Ukraine, and that is a fact. It was an action, and like other countries and sub-regional organizations, those were the statements issued up to the UN. So when the same statement was tabled at the United Nations, we voted for in condemnation of the Russian action to invade a sovereign country. And like I told you earlier, that we acted in tandem, not only with the position of the AU, but also the position of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So, but coming to the second vote, which was on the exclusion from the Human Rights Commission, to us, it was too hasty and devoid of adequate consultation prior to action. So rightfully, if you could see the countries of Africa, particularly the ones you mentioned as powerful African countries, the South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, we abstained. We did not run away from the responsibility, but we abstained because we believed it was too hasty at that point. How mediation was still going on. Too hasty in the sense that the first UN report that should have guided our action was yet to be presented. And it is just last week that Guterres went to visit Russia as well as Ukraine. So, and he presented his report just 3 days, is it 2 or 3 days back? So how come that a motion to suspend or to expel Russia could be taken before we even get the official report? So you could see that is what clearly guided the actions of our the African leaders. Then, but let me sum it up in a nutshell, that crisis of this nature, just as we are seeing today between Russia and Ukraine, they are like a theater actions. Theater action in the sense that the principle of might is right seems to be playing out as it has done in other countries such as Syria. It was the same scenario. It is the same thing that happened in Libya. It is also at a micro level, it's the same thing happening in Addis, the headquarters of the AU, because for Addis Ababa to attack Tigray, a province in the same country, and nobody could do anything about it. So I wish to crave the indulgence of this forum to probably hit it up on and summit on what Professor David Moye has said. Let's reorganize and reform the United Nations so that Africa can even have a voice. As it were now, Africa has no voice in the UN because we lack representation except on the non-permanent seats. And all the three non-permanent seat members voted same direction. So if further than that, we cannot go anywhere. So the UN reform becomes more imperative, looking at it from what has generated, what we have generated from the Ukraine-Russian crisis. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Manta. Before you come in, Professor David Moye, if the Africans were to listen to what you had to say, surely they would come up with a common position, either for, against, or to abstain, or to be out of the room. Surely, with a discussion along the lines you've outlined, the Africans should be able to find each other. Why don't they do that? There's also an argument that the Africans are being influenced by the Chinese to vote one way, by the Russians to vote another way, by the Americans and Europeans to vote another way. They're also being influenced by themselves and also maybe by issues of double standards. What are some of the fundamental reasons why Africans are voting in different ways? As you come in, Professor Moye, can you at least venture to tell us the reasons for the different ways Africans are voting, and also respond to your two colleagues and to the three speakers from the floor? Professor Moye.
Thank you very much. There are a number of reasons. I think, firstly, some of these challenges that the AU faces are systemic, where decisions are only taken based on the views of head of states, and the lack of continuity in terms of policy. Two is lack of policy within the AU itself, of understanding global issues. That weakness, I think we have seen it for a while. And the mere fact that the AU itself is funded by the very same, mainly outsiders. Key issues, peacekeeping on the African continent. At some point, it was up to 70% of peacekeeping missions are funded by resources from outside. Africans can't keep their own peace. We're talking about the Africa Trade Agreement, and we see that even the very same sacrosanct institution still gets resources from outsiders. How can you get money from people you're going to trade with? And I think there's a need for Africans to really unite. And this issue of Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone, it's quite a problem, stuck in a historical colonial mindset. So these are some of these teething problems that the AU has, but we also see the funding of sovereign states themselves, that the weaker, smaller, poor African states tend to follow, avoid taking independent foreign policy positions. I think this calls for a sort of a catalytic move to unite the continent in terms of its quest for integration, to allow and to defend smaller countries that I won't want to name names, but it doesn't matter how clear in terms of foreign policy of a particular small African country has, if 70% of their own national budget depends on donors. I mean, what do you expect? And it's unfair for us to even criticize them. Then 70%, 60% of their budget is coming from donors. And therefore, I think those who follow the views of those who channel resources to this country. But Chair, allow me to say worrying things and lessons that we are learning as Africans from this conflict. One, we see a move where the entire United Nations Security Council is no longer functioning. We are facing a grave danger of the United Nations going to be abandoned, like the League of Nations. Already United Nations Security Council is referring issue to General Assembly, which appears to be a good move. In absence of reforms of the entire structure, I think we still have a problem in terms of how the system works. But more fundamentally is the weaponization of global public goods. What do I mean by that? The Swiss system has been weaponized. The manner in which sanctions are applied, this selective morality that we see, as much as we're concerned with Ukraine and Ukrainian people at the receiving end with this unfortunate war, we are also seeing Palestinians dying on a daily basis. And we've come to accept as if it's normal for them to die. We see people in the Congo, massive numbers, millions dying. We see Libya, the entire Sahel region. In Yemen, British and American bombs are killing thousands of people. We watch and we're saying nothing, absolutely nothing. And what are we told? So those conflicts are different. And I really do not see the difference of these conflicts. Innocent people are dying. I think there is a need and a call for fairness in terms of anti-wars that we stand for. We should aspire to as Africans, pro-human rights, democracy, norms. As a matter of fact, I do not think the norms, democratic norms and values belong to the Western world. And that's another misconception that is selling quite on the African. As we see today, look what's issues of abortion in the United States. Look at how Europe, look at how Africans are treated in Ukraine. Racism remains an ugly issue we need to raise as Africans. African students were ill-treated during this war, were put in the back bencher, not to be evacuated. They should be the last one to be evacuated. And no one is saying anything. We just being asked to accept these developments as Africans. I think we need to call for fairness at the global level, call for peace in Ukraine, resolve the issues coming out of end of Cold War, and ensure that hegemony has no space, and there's also rise of an African voice as with its own agency, instead of seen in as following the powerful forces. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Munyai. I will get my last set of speakers from the floor, and then the speakers, the panelists will conclude. Okay, you got 3 minutes, actually 2 minutes, okay? Okay, you got 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair, and to the panelists for the enlightening discussion. I will start by saying that the Nigerian I want to thank the Nigerian High Commissioner for his comments, but his wishy, almost I would say wishy-washy stance on the disunity among African countries amplifies Professor Moyane's exasperation with the two most powerful sub-Saharan African countries, pretty much dropping the ball leadership. And I said this because we already know, and Professor Moyana has pointed out the debt profile, the aid dependency, and the way African countries are being teleguided. And he rightly pointed out, we're probably unfair in criticizing them. But when he raises the nostalgia about the years when we had Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, Bouteflika, what is one would expect that the idea of a concert or concerted foreign policy among these major African countries should be on the ground. We shouldn't expect 54 African countries to be in unison. At least these leaders, these pivotal states. But the problem again goes back to the way they've been hobbled by domestic problems, particularly the comatose leadership in foreign policy in Nigeria. And so, as he rightly puts the African concerns on the table, it's important. I would have expected him also, or maybe I shouldn't, since he's the High Commissioner. But it's important that we point that out. But the other issue that I would like to raise is the Ukrainian ambassador's patronizing statements about impending famine in Africa because of falling wheat imports and so on, but she ignores the way in which her country has been fueling wars and violence in Africa by raking in billions of dollars in selling small arms and light weapons that are fueling a lot of the crisis on the African continent. I feel sad at the devastation and loss of human lives and millions of refugees and IDPs generated by this war. But Ukrainians must recognize that they have been causing much more devastation on the African continent, whose countries are now being asked to fall in line and support Ukraine. Professor Moyana gave us contextualized some of the frustrations with some of the African countries. And
can you wind up?
Yes, I will. This last two sentences. Over 400,000 Africans fought in World War I. Over 1 million Africans died in World War II. Where are the war memorials in Europe for these Africans? And so history suggests that Africans, rightly so, should be careful in falling in headlong into the war in Ukraine. But we should also be cognizant of the role Ukraine itself has played in fueling some of these conflicts on the continent. And finally, the two countries really, South Africa and Nigeria, really need to start thinking about a concerted foreign policy, talking to one another, as Professor Mutambara asked. Why are they not talking to one another in providing the leadership that is needed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Agogo, you're next.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair. I'd just like to thank all the speakers for their insightful presentations, and also thank the Chair, Prof. Mutambara. A very enlightening conversation we have had. Without prejudice against any of the speakers, I am inclined to be very thankful, in particular to Professor Moniai, for the ways in which he provided a very, very succinct but very illuminating context. And I'm just saying, because I've seen some comments in the chat, and it's disturbing to see people echoing some of the sound bites that you hear on mainstream media. I would just like to caution that to dismiss the context, to dismiss history, to dismiss the context to any conflict is to make mediation and adjudication impossible. And war is the result. War results when there's a failure of mediation. There would always be crises, there will always be disagreements. But if we refuse to allow processes of mediation and arbitration, if we dismiss context, then we are the most aggressive. Then it's not necessarily the person who fires the first bullet that is the aggressor. It is those who combine through rhetoric, through a discourse to make mediation shameful. It would have been great to have somebody from the AU in this meeting. I don't know, Chair. Maybe that would have been fantastic. But it would be a good idea that Africa can use the current role is playing. I don't see it as a crisis. I don't see the African response as a crisis. Rather, I see it as an opportunity for Africa to show the world and to show Africa itself. Ambassador Manta referred to the issues in Ethiopia, which is very heartbreaking for me, given the place that Ethiopia plays in the African imaginary. We can use these responses, this decision to not support, to push for mediation. We can actually apply such an approach in the Ethiopian situation and insist in a kind of what could be an African way to the resolution of crisis. Instead of weaponizing rhetoric, weaponizing public goods, as Professor Monai has also resorted, we need to insist on the context. And I think this is somewhere Africa can play a very good role in this crisis. Thank you very much.
We're going to move on to the panelists. And I start with the ambassador, Ambassador Abravitova. Now, how will this war end? Some people have argued that most conflicts will end with negotiations, peace settlement, and an agreement. And the choice that the protagonists have is how many people you want to die before you settle, how much infrastructure you want destroyed before you settle. How do you see this war ending, Ambassador Abravitova? Is there any scope for negotiations leading to settlement and peace? And if so, when? In addition to answering questions that came from the floor and from your colleagues, Ambassador Abravitova, can you address us? You got 3 minutes.
Thank you, Professor. And I believe this is the question of yourself that you probably should ask not even the ambassador of Russian Federation, he cannot speak for himself, but Mr. Putin, only he knows when the war will be finished and how many more deaths of Ukrainians he needs and losses of infrastructure. Ukrainians didn't start this war and they are protecting their land today. I believe in diplomacy and in peaceful solution of any conflict. Otherwise, I would not be working where I'm working. And as you know, Ukrainians are negotiating with Russians and are calling to the direct negotiations between the President Zelensky and Putin, though we don't see the a desire from Russian side to sit at the table of negotiations. So maybe that will be somehow additional answer to your question, why Zelensky should speak to African Union. Yes, African Union is not united in its response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But the topic was not about African response would be the crisis, or not united response would be the crisis, isn't it? And it is not. As many diverse opinions as we have today during these discussions, which I respect, otherwise that would not be a discussion, the same dialogue has to be launched on more general level, and we speak about the African Union. And maybe that would be the main request from my president, to push with all possible means to the, by the way, main supplier of weapons in African continent, which is Russia, to sit at the table of negotiations with Ukraine, which is under the attack of neo-Nazist and neo-colonialist today. The issue that was brought forward regarding the racism in Ukraine, and I'm very glad, Professor, that you raised this, and I hope that you have your own expertise on this in this country where we've seen a lot of xenophobia and in peaceful times. In Ukraine, in the times of war that started unprecedentedly, immediately, of Russian invasion, when 9,000 African students that most probably were suffering from racism, I don't know, but since 1991 in independent Ukraine, they were feeling very peacefully. They were fleeing from Ukraine, facing the same challenges Ukrainians were facing on the borders. And I don't think it's fair in this particular platform to use this propaganda to condemn Ukraine in something that never existed. And I'm grateful that you brought it forward. I think that selective morality is indeed the matter of the big problem that we are facing today, because we are trying to differentiate the victims of war, which doesn't have to happen, because every life matters in any part of the world. And today, Ukraine is just one of the conflicts. But my message to all of you was that this particular conflict has got a very global ramifications and further complications. And if I would be allowed to speak more, I would not speak about food security only. But in 15 minutes, you can speak about the major factors that are important today for a particular place of the world. But of course, out of this, there will be some positive perspectives for both Ukraine and African countries. And we can speak about this separately on the separate platform on occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll move on to Ambassador Mohamed Manta. What are the lessons to Nigeria from this crisis in terms of the African response? What are the lessons to the AU in terms of the African response in this crisis? In addition to other questions from the floor and from your colleagues, the moment is yours, Ambassador Manta.
Thank you, Professor. The lessons for the entire African continent and of course to humanity is that sanctity of lives and property is gradually and more convincingly being eroded. If we put humanity first as our point of service, crisis could be avoided. Like my colleague, the ambassador, rightfully said, the Russia-Ukraine crisis did not start on the 24th of February. The generating factors were already at play. We ignored them. When the Russians issued statements about feeling, growing insecurity that their neighbors were fraternizing with the West, particularly NATO. Nobody gave any care so much about what it could lead to. And judging from what Professor Monga has told us, when you see the horizon, like the African proverb which says, when your neighbor's beards catch fire, then you begin to rub water on yours so that when the fire escalates, your beard could be saved. So we failed to do that. And it has come to catch us with us. The time that other countries were being invaded, we have already made classic cases with Syria, with Libya, with our backdoor neighbor, Eritrea and Tigray. All these crises around the world, and the continuous and unending crisis between Israel and Palestine. What actions have we taken? You do not. If we failed to act correctly in the past one, it means we had no instrument to address the Ukrainian-Russian crisis in a different way. So it has gone the same straight line that the world is doing nothing, and Africa has joined the world to do nothing. So the only thing we could do, and which the world we should do, is to condemn and agree. The best approach, if we go back to the table, like I said, David is a professor, so he lectures. I am a policymaker. I implement policies as an administrator. I'm told to do this, and I just do. So we don't have too many words to spare. What assignment that Prof will do 20 pages, I will summarize. I'll just write 3 pages, and so that my president can give the next go ahead, because he wouldn't have time to read 20 pages. So I am saying that the African perspective and the charter establishing the African Union is very specific, and they acted just in that way. The Secretariat itself issued a statement, just like the UN Secretariat. The Secretary General issued a statement condemning the invasion of Ukraine. The AU chairperson at the AU Secretariat issued a statement condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because we believe in the territorial integrity of all member states and all states of the world. So no nation state will aggressively attack another and will not receive condemnation from the AU. That was done. And when it was upgraded to the UN, almost all African countries did the same. We condemned the invasion of Ukraine. Russia has no right under international law to have invaded Ukraine in the first place. But since they did, the AU and the most of the African condemned the action. But like I said earlier, when it came to the issue of expulsion from the Human Rights Commission, to us, that issue should have been raised after a first report has been received, not based on media propaganda, which the two countries are very, very vast in. Even the Ukrainians are not left behind in the propaganda war. If you tune on to the television, and they are being heavily backed by the Western media. So if you now you are in South Africa, you will discover that you can no longer get the Russian channel. It's been blocked. And so going to vote at that time should have been after the official state visitation and report of the UN, which just came a few days back. And of course, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Egypt, Algeria all decided on the right path to abstain. And that was what we did. So I would say that Zelensky requesting to address the African president is a welcome development, and is still within the line of mediation. So if that visit will bring the desired result, that they will go back to the negotiation table, and for the two leaders to see themselves as neighbors. Like sometimes I like the African proverbs. The African proverb which says that you can change your friends anytime, but you can't change your neighbor. So whether Ukraine or Russia likes it or not, they will still have to share borders. There's no way. But if for any reason either of them decides to change their friends in the international community, they are free to do so, but they cannot change their borders. they will remain neighbors, and therefore mediation should be the key, and the United Nations should spearhead that, irrespective of the weak pillars we have enumerated and rightfully elucidated by Professor, that we are on a weak pedestal, because when the UN sits, Africa is not there, because they are not, they don't have a permanent voice in the UN. So, and our non-permanent members can only but raise up their hands at times when it is taken into vote, but the veto is not there. So please, on this note, I wish to end my address.
Okay. Professor Munyai, as you come in, have the African intellectuals done enough to provide an alternative worldview on this matter? Have the African media done enough to provide an alternative view on this matter, given the propaganda we're receiving from the Western media and the Western leaders? Where is the African intellectual in terms of the discourse? Where is the African media in terms of the discourse? In addition to the questions from the floor and from your colleagues, Professor Munyai, the moment is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I think in the interest of time, I'd like, firstly, a direct answer. The African intelligentsia faces similar challenge as African politicians, leaders. At the heart of its lack of resources and the lack of broadening understanding, particularly historical factors, of really understanding that Ukrainians and Russians are not that different. I mean, they're the same people. I mean, you have to understand. They might differ in certain areas, but historically, they've been neighbors for centuries. And it's unfortunate that we have the situation we have. We are gravely concerned. And I think I would end by a call, appeal to the ambassador of Ukraine to send a cable to President Zelensky in terms of the key things that I would appeal humbly, that selection of individuals with a good standing, understanding situation from the world to reach to both President Zelensky and President Putin, given the antagonistic nature between Russia and NATO. I think it's to call for envoys. I mean, from African continent, I would suggest former President Baki, former President Obasanjo, the US former President Carter, for instance, and quite a number of leaders in Asia, Latin America. A group of leaders try to break the discussions and package it, negotiation between Ukraine and Russia on one hand, Russia and NATO on the other hand, and ensure that you combine. And lastly, I would say one of the leading scholars and former diplomat, Henry Kissinger, had an outstanding essay. I disagree with all his writings, but on this particular one, I 100% agree with him. He said it is not in Ukraine's interest to join NATO. Ukraine should be a bridge between Russia and NATO countries, and it should play a constructive role and benefit even more from both the relationship with in Europe as well as Russia. So looking at the situation, this is a power situation. You can bring in more weapons. You can, yes, we fully support for people who fight for self-determination. However, I really do not see a situation in which Russia will just back off. The roundtable is the answer. And I think if we can call upon the African leaders to also call for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. That's the only way, You can put as many drones, as many new high tech and these new wars testing in Ukraine, but it is not, it's taking us nowhere. And the lessons of Libya and Syria and Iraq that Ukraine need to be aware of is that all these weapons are being pumped in. In the post-conflict, chances are high that civil wars, instability, not just in Ukraine, learn it from us in Africa. When Libyan state was destroyed, we have a crisis right up to Nigeria of terrorism and all sorts. And I do not think that there is Ukrainian exceptionalism. If more and more weapons are being dumped in that part, it doesn't matter by who, whether by Russians or by NATO, it is not going to bring peace in the end. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end as we conclude. Tapiwa, are you there? Are you ready, Tapiwa, from the floor?
Thank you, Professor, for organizing this, yourself and the Institute and all the other panelists. Thank you, the ambassadors, for your contributions, your contextualizations. For me, it's just an overall comment, if I may, just, we are all humans, we bleed the same blood, but maybe perhaps to urge that, issues, in addition to the context that have been provided by the political scientists and experts among us, to depersonalize the issues. It's probably not about President Zelensky, it's probably not about President Putin, it's about the people. Also, not to forget the voices of people in the Donbas region, the voices of people that are facing conflict all over the world. And hopefully we might emerge with a new world order going forward for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very good discussion this evening. It's not just an academic discussion. There's a war going on. People are being killed. Infrastructure is being destroyed. So we need answers. And the Africans must do more than voting in a diverse manner. They must also participate in the provision of solutions. They must also provide intellectual inputs into the discourse. And so I want to thank you all for your participation, ambassadors and Professor Monyai. The discussion must continue, but in particular, we must resolve the conflict, the war in Ukraine. But I want to thank you very much for coming, and we've come to the end of our discussion. Anthony, you have a few words to conclude, Anthony?
Thank you, Prof. My name is Anthony Kaziboni. I'm the head of research at the IFK. I found this discussion immensely enlightening. And without a shadow of doubt, this conversation has to a great extent demonstrated how and why there are divergent views in the crisis in Ukraine. The loss of life is deeply lamentable. The position of various countries in Africa is influenced by many factors, including China's relationship with Russia and how China itself is Africa's largest trading partner. Issues around Washington's double standards have been raised by African countries. US's aggression in Iraq, NATO, and the killing of Gaddafi. And some countries already feel that a neutral stance is safe. Taking sides might not be a strategic move. I'd like just to quickly reflect on the role of the declining role of the United Nations. Some of the reasons for abstaining from voting indicates features in the structure and character of the organization. So some countries, including South Africa, have raised issues on how some of the resolutions have been submitted without adequate consultation and input from member states. The 21st geopolitical landscape does not reflect the structure of the United Nations. At its founding, 1945, there were 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which were France, China, Russia, the UK, and the US. The UK is not the major power in Europe anymore. Africa doesn't have a representative at the United Nations Security Council. And it's time to reform the UN so that it reflects the realities of the 21st century. From my end, please look out for our third and last event around this crisis. To watch our past events, please visit our website, futureofknowledge.org, and also the IFK official YouTube channel, Institute for the Future of Knowledge. Once again, we are grateful to our speakers, Ambassador Abrifotova, Ambassador Aruna Manta, and Professor David Monyai for your very insightful comments. And most of all, thank you for joining us in this very important discussion.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.